In 1943, the Academy Award for Best Documentary went to a man who spent his time perched high in the canopy of a New Guinea jungle, dodging bullets with an 8-kilogram camera strapped to his chest. That cameraman was Damien. He defied military orders to get up to the absolute front line, capturing raw footage of Australian troops that became his country's first ever Oscar-winning production. The film he shot documented a brutal campaign along the Kokoda Track, and in a grim coincidence, the word Kokoda itself comes from the local Oroqiva language. It translates directly to place of skulls. Nobody planned that irony, but it perfectly foreshadowed what would become Australia's defining and arguably most deeply misunderstood battle of the Second World War. By July 1942, Japanese forces landed in northern Papua. Their objective: march across the Owen Stanley Range to seize Port Moresby. This would give Japan a foothold to sever supply routes between the US and Australia, putting the mainland in direct danger. If you grew up hearing about Kokoda, you likely know the popular post-war legend. The story usually features hopelessly outnumbered Australian underdogs, surviving almost supernaturally brutal terrain, fighting a Japanese army that blindly stumbled into the jungle. Modern historical evidence paints a very different picture. The popular narrative is largely a myth, constructed after the fact, and the unvarnished reality is actually much darker and vastly more impressive. The first myth to go is the idea that the Japanese Imperial Army had no idea what they were walking into. Japanese intelligence had meticulously surveyed and mapped the entire track years before the invasion. They coordinated this espionage right out of a consulate office in Sydney. They knew exactly how steep the mountains were. They knew there were no vehicle roads, and they planned their logistics accordingly. Waiting for this highly prepared invasion force was the Australian 39th Battalion. The public mockingly called them Chokos, assuming they would melt under pressure. Australia's most experienced combat troops were still fighting in Africa. The men left behind to defend the track were mostly teenagers. Some were just 17 years old. They had virtually zero combat training, and they were holding First World War-era rifles. Yet these under-equipped militia boys mounted a desperate, grueling fighting retreat. They slowed the Japanese advance down just long enough for reinforcements to arrive, effectively saving the entire campaign. Then there is the legend of the track itself, routinely framed as the deadliest, most uniquely hostile jungle terrain on Earth. Historians point out that this was actually one of the less forbidding routes through the Owen Stanleys. What made it a killing ground was the fact that they were fighting a modern war over mountains with zero vehicles, meaning there was absolutely no way to evacuate a wounded soldier except by carrying them out by hand. This impossible task fell to the Papuan carriers. Post-war propaganda sanitized them as the smiling, willing, Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels. The brutal truth is that many of these men were forcefully conscripted into service, with some communities hiding their men in the bush to keep them from being taken. The conditions they endured were lethal. Men accustomed to the blistering heat of the coast were marched up into freezing mountain altitudes. They carried staggering loads, often catching pneumonia from the extreme exposure.
Despite being forced into a war that wasn't theirs and suffering extreme casualties of their own, there is no record of a Papuan carrier ever abandoning an Australian, an endless, overwhelming horde of Japanese soldiers. This chart compares the total casualties of the campaign. Modern translations of Japanese unit records reveal that total combat losses were roughly comparable. The true equalizer was disease. Malaria, dysentery, and scrub typhus ravaged both sides equally, accounting for thousands of casualties before a single shot was fired. The terror of Kokoda came from the ferocious intimacy of the fighting. At the Battle of Isarava, as the Australian lines were collapsing, Private Bruce Kingsbury grabbed a Bren gun from a wounded comrade. He charged the Japanese line completely alone, firing a dying man's machine gun from the hip to break the enemy advance. He was killed by a sniper seconds later, earning the only Victoria Cross ever awarded on the track. During that same battle, a soldier named Bissett was torn apart by machine gun fire. His older brother Stan, a Wallaby rugby star who had met the King of England just a year earlier, found him in the mud. Stan sat in the jungle, holding his dying brother, talking about their childhood for 6 hours until Butch passed away. These human stories highlight the true nature of the campaign.
The horror was born from the psychological toll of a deeply intimate, inescapable slaughter, fought inches apart in the mud. By September, the Japanese advance reached a ridge called Iribiwa, just 42 kilometers from Port Moresby, but their supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, and the men were starving. The Australian counteroffensive began, pushing the decimated Japanese forces into a chaotic retreat. Leading that retreat was the Japanese commander, General Tomitaro Horii. Horii was a disciplinarian who had strictly ordered his troops to fight honorably and refrain from looting the local villages. Fleeing his failed invasion, Horii and his staff reached the flooded Kumusi River. Desperate to cross, he attempted to escape in an abandoned wooden canoe. Instead, a sudden storm caught the tiny boat. He was swept out to sea and drowned. His orderly survived to report the death, though the military concealed it to preserve morale. Horii's unceremonious end completely encapsulated the entire campaign, a highly structured imperial war machine completely dismantled by the unforgiving environment. On November 16, 1942, Australian forces marched back into Kokoda village, securing the airfield and ending the campaign. Port Moresby and mainland Australia were safe. Today, the Kokoda Track sits alongside Gallipoli as a foundational pillar of Australian military identity, remembered as a defining test of endurance and mateship. But we don't need the post-war legends of superhuman soldiers, mythical terrain, or fumbling enemies to understand its importance. The myths were completely unnecessary inventions. The unvarnished truth is that terrified teenagers, forcefully conscripted carriers, and desperate men fought an impossible logistical war, carried each other through the mud, and survived. And that is the only legend that actually matters.